Hello, History 362. So today we're going to be talking about the story so far. How do we get to 338, the Battle of Kyrania, the moment when the kingdom of Macedon crushes the Greek city-states and then really sets itself up as the hegemonic power of the entire Eastern Mediterranean and in a position to potentially, although still improbably, challenge the mighty Achaemenid Empire. So let's think about where things stand in the middle of the 4th century BC. Macedonia, is a kingdom. It is ruled by these traditional kings, King Basileus, and it is an ethnic kingdom. So what the Greeks might call an ethnos of Macedonia, so people who identify as ethnically Macedonian. There is still a lot of question, at least amongst the Greeks, about whether the Macedonians are even considered Greek. I may actually talk about that in a separate lecture. But suffice it to say, they speak a dialect that is seen as distinct from Greek, even though many of the kings and their court and their aristocracy would speak probably an Attic dialect of Greek in their court and practice many other forms of Greek culture. But suffice it to say, up till now, up to the middle of the 4th century BC, Macedonia has been a backwater. It's been one of the more backward polities in Greece. The traditional powers in mainland Greece and indeed in the Aegean more broadly are city-states. The poleis, particularly 3 of them, probably the most powerful city-states, who sort of triangulate amongst themselves in terms of their military, diplomatic, and geopolitical policies. The 3 big powers up to the middle of the 4th century BC are Athens, a great naval power, Sparta, and until the 371, the greatest land power, and Thebes. Those are the states that really matter and have sort of networks of alliances around each other and fight big hegemonic wars against each other, like the Peloponnesian War, which involves Athens against Thebes and Sparta and their broader sets of allies. Those are the most important powers, these city-states in the Aegean, but of course there is then the hyperpower of Achaemenid Persia, which spans a huge territorial extent from Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, all the way to modern-day Afghanistan. Although one important thing to note about the nature of Achaemenid Persia and its ability to sort of project power and influence is that, while it's clearly a big empire that can muster extraordinary resources in terms of military manpower, in terms of labor, in terms of financial resources and goods, foodstuffs, its ability to project power in all of its peripheries can at times vary. So at times, while Achaemenid Persia is, as a whole, much exponentially more powerful than, say, Athens or Sparta, the ability of the Achaemenid Persians to necessarily project power into the Aegean wavers. And of course, famously, the Achaemenids are defeated by the Athenians at Marathon in 490 BC and by a coalition of Greek city-states at Salamis and subsequently at the Battle of Plataea in 480 and 479. And that's not that the Achaemenids are weak, it's just they struggle to project power into the periphery, the sort of distant frontier for them of the Aegean. So that's kind of the world that we're looking at in the middle of the 4th century BC. One thing that is notable is that all of our established powers in the middle of the 4th century BC take some bad hits. The Spartans suffer a terrible military defeat at the hands of the Thebans in 371 BC at the Battle of Leuctra, which is a significant portion of the Spartiate elite, the sort of warrior caste that spends all of they spend all of their lives training to be warriors. A significant portion of that Spartan caste is killed off at the Battle of Leuctra, and subsequently the Thebans march into the Peloponnese and liberate the helots, the serfs, that actually feed the Spartans. And so these two facts, they don't necessarily end Spartan power, but they dramatically diminish the Spartans' ability to be anything other than a kind of regional power in the southern Peloponnese. Now, so the Spartans are taking a bad hit by the middle of the 4th century BC. So too have the Athenians, who they were defeated by the Spartans in the Peloponnesian War at the end of the 5th century, but really come back in the early 4th century. But they suffer in the middle of the 4th century BC a revolt of their naval allies. The allies who provide not just the ships, but importantly the money that allows Athens to maintain its large fleet. And this is in itself a real setback. Athens, by the middle of the 4th century into the late 4th century BC, is still the most important and impressive navy in the Aegean, but it's really having trouble financing, and it's having trouble keeping those large fleets actually out and deployed on the Mediterranean. And this is going to diminish the ability of the Athenians to resist the eventual rise of Macedonia. Thebes, which after the Battle of Leuctra has this period of hegemony, pretty quickly wastes it in a long and dispiriting war against the Phocians. This is oftentimes referred to as the Third Sacred War, because the Phocians, among other things, capture Delphi, the great Greek sanctuary, take all of the money that's stored in the treasury and use it to hire mercenaries. And as a result, the Thebans have trouble beating the Phocians, who are otherwise not a particularly important power in Greece. But when they held this money and turn it into mercenary labor, they're able to hold out against the Thebans. And this really, over the long run, this long, grinding, dispiriting war, really kind of limits whatever ambitions the Thebans might have with their hard-won hegemony after their, again, great victory over the Spartans in 371. So all of our Greek city-states are therefore hurting in their own way by the middle of the 4th century. And that actually kind of creates an opening for this previous backwater of Macedonia to emerge as a new regional power, super regional power in the Aegean and northern Balkans. Because the Macedonians have, again, always been backwards. Macedonian kings are traditionally very, very weak. There are, I'm going to use a medieval term, but there are barons, basically, big local strongmen who may pledge kind of limited fealty to the king of Macedonia, but basically live up in the Macedonian highlands and basically run things their own way. And occasionally ride out and serve as cavalry when the king needs them for a campaign. So it's a weak state with a weak king, and as a result, the Macedonians just constantly get pushed around. They get pushed around by the Athenians. They are conquered by the Persians in 492 and forced to acknowledge the suzerainty of the Persian Empire, at least for a while. In 359, there is an invasion of the Illyrians. One additional problem that Macedonian kings have is Macedonia is kind of like this huge buffer state, that all of the sort of tribal peoples who live up in the northern Balkans and along the Danube, if they want to go raiding to the south to sort of raid against the sort of rich pickings of the Greek mainland, they have to go through Macedonia. So Macedonia kind of does this service and oftentimes keeping these tribal groups out of Greece, but it also this is at a significant cost. In 359, there's a terrible defeat. The king of Macedonia goes down fighting, and the Macedonians, this king, Amytos, has a son, but the son is an infant. And a decision is made to promote for a brief moment his uncle Philip as regent, and then within a few months, Philip is proclaimed the king, displacing this infant son. It's the Macedonians who vote for their king in an army assembly decide they need a mature adult. Philip is going to be a truly dynamic king, and he has a real nation-building agenda. He's not just interested in staving off the Illyrians and then going back to the palace in Pella and drinking wine. He's the kind of guy who doesn't let a crisis go to waste. And so Philip II, in this military emergency, starts to undertake a number of reforms that make both his position within the Macedonian state much, much stronger, but also over time will make the Macedonian kingdom much more militarily powerful. So a key reform that on the military side of things is primarily, up till then it seems the Macedonians are primarily cavalry, and these cavalry are recruited from, again, these sort of Macedonian aristocrats who have big kind of feudal estates, serve as cavalry, but then go back to doing their own thing. Philip, in this emergency, creates a new infantry force that he drills very carefully. It's going to be initially 10,000 men strong. He arms them with a local Macedonian pike called a sarissa, and the sarissa, it seems, is initially somewhere around 16 feet long, and that the sarissa keeps growing over the course of Hellenistic military history. But he's armed with a pike rather than the shorter spear that Greek soldiers tend to carry. It also seems that he tends to array this mass of pikemen at a greater depth than Greek formations are accustomed to fighting. It seems that he learns this from the Thebans. The Thebans are themselves experimenting with deeper, denser formations. And Philip is briefly a hostage in Thebes, and he seems to be sort of aware of some of these military developments. So Philip creates a new kind of model army, this big pike phalanx, and this allows him to, mobilize the significant population of Macedonia. I mean, Macedonia, because it's a big kingdom, probably has a population that is larger than any of the Greek city-states, maybe even larger than, the three big ones combined, probably quite easily 300 to 500,000 free citizens, although that's a guess. And so Philip has this new army, and after beating back the Illyrians and sort of restoring the peace, he then goes on a campaign of conquest, trying to subdue local rivals in Thessaly, Pannonia, kind of all around Macedonia. And importantly, he focuses a lot of his efforts on conquering the very rich mining regions in the northern Aegean. And this includes actually places that are inhabited by Greeks, like Amphipolis and the Chalcidic Peninsula. But this allows him to, he basically conquers areas where there are large gold and silver mines. And this is going to be the way that Philip is able to finance his efforts, is that he is now mining significant amounts of precious metals, which he can then use to pay this crack army. And this is important because he now has so much money that he can keep these troops in the field, gaining experience, practicing their drill, being very good at war year-round. So again, it's not just that he has the military formation, it's also that he's taking the efforts to gain the resources to finance his enterprise. And so Philip fights a series of wars, and of course he's not just a warrior. Philip is a really good diplomat, and he uses diplomacy to cement his position. One thing that you can use to track his diplomatic efforts are his wives. Macedonian kings are polygamous. They marry multiple wives when it is diplomatically convenient. And Philip has a wife from Thessaly. The most famous wife, the mother of Alexander, Olympia, is from Epirus. He probably has some women who are either wives or mistresses from places like Pannonia. And so he has a whole series of wives, but in marrying them, that's actually part of the kind of peace arrangements that he's making to solidify his position in the various sort of peripheries around his expanded kingdom. Now, Philip gets himself involved in the Third Sacred War, particularly by trying to conquer city-states in Thessaly that have the voting rights to to control the sanctuary at Delphi. It's a sort of tedious. The details are tedious. But suffice to say, he uses his territorial aggrandizement to also insert himself into Greek religious affairs. And finally, he comes into conflict after a lot of back and forth diplomacy and kind of skirmishing with the Athenians. He emerges quite suddenly across into mainland Greece, appears outside of Elatria, which is basically moving into central Greece. The Athenians and Thebans very quickly put together a coalition against Philip, and they meet his invading army in 338 at Kyrania, which is in Boeotia, and a place where there have actually been a series of battles, in part because if you're just sort of moving through Boeotia, it's a kind of place where armies tend to pass, and therefore they bump into each other and fight each other. The battle is very close fought, although Philip, who commands the heavy infantry, successfully executes a kind of withdrawal, and the Athenians and Thebans pursue, and then he turns around with his well-trained, well-disciplined forces and counterattacks as they fall into disarray. And Philip's son, Alexander, who at this point is a teenager, probably 16, leads a cavalry charge successfully against the Theban right, and ultimately the Macedonians prevail. There was heavy casualties, including the Theban Sacred Band, a kind of professional cadre that the city of Thebes maintains. The Theban Sacred Band is supposedly killed to a man, all 300 of them. And we have actually recovered 250 plus skeletons buried together, which most people identify as this unit, which died on the battlefield, kind of covering the retreat of the rest of the Greeks. So 338 in the Battle of Kyrania, Thebes and Athens quickly capitulate, and Philip decides that the way that he's going to exert control over the Greeks is to set up something called the League of Corinth, a koinon, a league of Greek city-states, and the league will meet at Corinth, and of course one of the things they do is elect Philip as the general of the league. And Philip, probably either shortly after the battle, maybe even before, decides that the best thing that he can do to sort of unite the Greek city-states, now that he's effectively exerted hegemony over them, is to tell them to send troops and then lead those troops on a campaign against the Persians. This is actually something that some Greek intellectuals, particularly the pro-Macedonian Athenian intellectual Isocrates, have been urging. The idea of all these Greeks were fighting all these wars, and they're petty and destructive. What if we all united in a feel-good campaign against the real enemy, an enemy we've built up as an other for centuries, a Achaemenid Persian? Philip now actually wants to do this. And so already preparations are underway. In 336, there's actually a vanguard of Macedonian troops who have crossed over the Hellespont and are kind of hold a toehold that will eventually allow a follow-on invasion. But in 336, as Philip is preparing to celebrate at a festival, and in this festival at Aigai, he is going to parade images of all 12 Olympian gods, and behind those images there's going to be a 13th image, and it's going to be an image of a statue of Philip himself. I mean, this is an extraordinarily self-aggrandizing moment. But he is then assassinated in this theater by a former bodyguard who seems to have a kind of personal dispute with him, and that bodyguard is quickly hunted down and killed. But in 336, Philip II, who has built the Macedonian state from a backwater to a powerhouse, is dead. His son Alexander, technically Alexander III, the third king of Macedonia to have the name Alexander, is pretty quickly proclaimed king, although he ruthlessly liquidates various relatives who may have a counterclaim. And Alexander in 336 is therefore a king and plans to take over his father's campaign against the Persians. He's elected the general, the strategos of the Corinthian League. And so next time we'll talk about Alexander prior to his Persian campaigns, and also talk a little bit more about the Macedonians and the nature of the Macedonian kingdom. So we'll talk more soon, but that is the story so far to 336 and the ascension of Alexander the Great.